Okay, it's 3:15 and right on time, and the room is pretty full, so we should get started. Welcome to Deploying Reporting Services in SharePoint Mode, Why and How. My name is Ricardo Muti. I'm a Senior Program Manager on the Reporting Services team at Microsoft headquarters back in Redmond. From this session, I want you to take away three things about reporting services in SharePoint Mode. Number one, why do you need it? Or at least want it? And number two, how does it work? And finally, number three, how do you actually get it working? How do you get it up and running? The way I'm going to do that is with a mix of some slides about the functionality, about the architecture, and with a couple of actual demos going into actual configuration to get things up and running. We'll start with looking at what functionality is integrated. When we say that reporting services is integrated into SharePoint Mode, exactly what functionality is integrated. Then we'll look at, given that you have a choice when you install reporting services, you have a choice between SharePoint integrated mode and native mode, which is not integrated into SharePoint, what are the benefits of choosing SharePoint integrated mode over native mode? And then on the flip side, are there any limitations or any drawbacks to choosing SharePoint integrated mode? And then we'll look into the architecture. We have multiple products involved. We have SharePoint, we have reporting services. You might have seen from some of the Power View sessions that you've got integration with Excel services now. How do all these different products and the components within them integrate with one another? What does that architecture look like? So I'll explain that in a good amount of detail. Then we'll switch over to a demo, and I'll show you just setting up reporting services in SharePoint. To get the basics up and running, we'll render some classic reporting services reports. We'll render some Power View reports. We'll show Power View working in Excel services. And then we're going to switch back and talk about one of the more complex pieces of this whole thing, which is now that Power View is integrated into Excel services, Excel workbooks connect to a variety of different data sources, and there are multiple options for how the end user or how the system can authenticate to those different data sources. And there's a lot of stuff that has to be set up or configured the right way so that your users can use all of those options and they all work. And then we'll switch over to a demo of that, and I'll show some of the errors that you might get if it's not configured correctly, and show you how to configure it correctly. And then we'll show it working after we've done the proper configuration. So if that sounds good, we'll proceed right along. First of all, reporting services in SharePoint mode, we say it's integrated into SharePoint. How much of it is really integrated? How deep is the integration? When most BI vendors talk about them having SharePoint integration and being able to check that box on the checklist saying we have SharePoint integration, they're usually talking about this. They're talking about report viewing, in the sense that I can take a report and I can have my users be able to view it within the context of a SharePoint page. Maybe it takes over the whole page. Maybe the report or part of it is hosted within a web part on a page. We've had that since SQL Server 2000 reporting services, before we even really had something that we called SharePoint integrated mode. With native mode, we shipped web parts for SharePoint so that you could host reports in SharePoint. And many of our competitors or third parties offer these web parts as well. So a lot of BI vendors can do this. But most of them, that's where they draw the line. And there's so much more, so much further that you can go with SharePoint integration. So the next step is, great, you can view your reports in SharePoint, but where are these reports actually stored? Where is the catalog of all your BI artifacts, including all your reports? How do you deploy them there? How do you manage them there? How do you manage permissions on them? Usually the answer is that that part's not in SharePoint. That part is in some other portal, or maybe multiple other portals and tools that you use for report deployment, that you use for report catalog management, and that you use for security. Certainly true of reporting services in native mode, where your other portal that I'm referring to is called Report Manager. You can view the report in SharePoint in a web part, but for you to actually publish a report, it's not like saving the document to SharePoint. If you want to change permissions on it, there's no document in SharePoint that you can change those permissions on. You're doing all that stuff via a totally separate portal called Report Manager. And again, a lot of other products that don't have as deep SharePoint integration, it will be a similar story. With SQL Server 2005 Service Pack 2, we introduced what we first called SharePoint integrated mode for reporting services. And what that does is it actually integrates the catalog, the reporting services catalog, into SharePoint. So the catalog where you store your reports is just SharePoint sites and SharePoint document libraries. And the reports are just documents like any other document in those libraries. If you want to create a subscription to a report so you get it emailed to you every Monday morning or something, you don't have to go to Report Manager to do that anymore. You can do that right from the document in SharePoint with an add-in and extensions that we've built into SharePoint. If you want to manage permissions on the report, who can view it, who can edit it, you just edit those permissions on the SharePoint document like any other SharePoint document. In SQL Server 2012, we completed the third piece, which is management. We integrated manageability and administration and even a lot of the deployment and the initial configuration process into SharePoint. So when you used to have to deploy and initially configure reporting services, you didn't do the configuration, the post-install configuration through SharePoint. You did it through a separate tool called Reporting Services Configuration Manager. If you wanted to back up the encryption keys or something like that, you go to Reporting Services Configuration Manager. If you wanted to do scale out, same thing, Reporting Services Configuration Manager. If you wanted to do any of these things in an unattended, sort of programmatic or scripted way, you wouldn't do it through SharePoint, you would do it through WMI or one of our custom APIs that we provide. And so if every service worked that way, everything would be a little bit different. Even though visually it's integrated into SharePoint, on the back end, IT would have the complexity of managing these different services in all these different ways. So we wanted to do that in SharePoint as well. So in SQL Server 2012, what we did was we made an architecture change. Reporting services in SharePoint integrated mode, even when we had an add-in, the add-in was very much the front-end web server components. The real execution of reports, the real engine, the real core of reporting services was still in a separate Windows service that was not integrated into SharePoint. And that's one reason why you needed separate tools to manage it. In SQL Server 2012, what we did was we took the reporting services engine, we took the server and the hosting layer and all that, and we wrapped it in a new service application, which is SharePoint's sort of model for services that run within SharePoint. And now that runs as a service application like anything else, like Performance Point, like Excel services, any of those other service applications. The way you manage a service application is through standard SharePoint tools. So from a UI perspective, you can go into SharePoint Central Administration, and that's where you're going to see a lot of the management for reporting services. If you want to program it or script it, you do that through PowerShell, through the SharePoint PowerShell console. So now, pretty much end-to-end, we have the leading integration into SharePoint, and everything from report viewing to the real back-end stuff like scale-out configuration is all integrated into SharePoint. So why should you use SharePoint integrated mode as opposed to native mode? For one thing, the ideal would be to have one portal. From a Microsoft perspective, we would like to have one portal for all of our scenarios, for all of our products, and that is SharePoint. From your perspective, it'd be nice if all your users only had to go to one place to do all the things that they want to do within your intranet, and that would be SharePoint. Everything would look consistent, everything would work consistently, so we want to achieve that. Even from an IT perspective, again, you don't want to go through 10 different tools to configure 10 different services. You want it to be consistent and all pulled together in one portal. So SharePoint integration, especially after SQL Server 2012, brings you all of that. Along with that, like I said, kind of along those same lines, you have a common look and feel because Report Manager and SharePoint don't look exactly the same, and the configuration tool certainly looks a lot different. So now everything looks like SharePoint. If you're familiar with how to use things and manage things in SharePoint, you'll have that common look and feel. Finally, if you think about reporting services native mode and what it gives you in terms of different levels of hierarchy and isolation, yeah, you have a folder hierarchy and a file hierarchy, and maybe you can have some sort of isolation there with permissions. But it's really one big flat site. Whereas in SharePoint, what's nice is you can have a SharePoint farm that can scale quite large, and you can have different sites and different subsites for different divisions in your company, for different teams, for different projects, even personal sites, my sites. So you have that multi-site capability when you have SharePoint. Because these reports are just documents in SharePoint libraries, like any other documents, you can do the typical things that you can do with SharePoint documents. So for example, if you want whenever anybody publishes a report, you want to kick off a workflow to do something, you can do that. In reporting services, we don't necessarily have first-class knowledge or support of any of these things, within SharePoint. Like there's no real specific integration of reporting services and SharePoint workflow. But on the other side, there's nothing to stop you from hooking up a SharePoint workflow when somebody publishes a report and doing whatever you want to do with it. Security, like I mentioned, with it being integrated into SharePoint, the way you manage permissions on report is nicely aligned with the way you manage permission on Excel workbooks and all sorts of other documents in SharePoint. I marked this with an asterisk because this is new in SQL 2012, but the manageability piece is now integrated into SharePoint. So again, things like encryption key backups, scale out, all sorts of things you do through SharePoint Central Admin now. Finally, there are some features, major features, that are only available in SharePoint integrated mode. They are not available in native mode, at least not today. One of them is called data alerts. And if you're familiar with reporting services subscriptions, where you can say on a schedule, every end of the month or every Monday morning or something, render this report and send it to me by email. This is similar, but I would characterize it as exception-driven reporting or reporting by exception or event-driven reporting. And you can say something like, when this value, this KPI, or any of these values in this table, if any of them exceed some threshold, then I want you to alert me and send me an email. And in the email, don't just send me the whole report. Send me the specific items that met the criteria and exceeded the threshold, or whatever the condition that I specified was. I want to know when some condition is met. Otherwise, if those conditions are not met, I don't need to know. So that's only available in SharePoint integrated mode. And then there's the big one, which is PowerView. Probably heard a ton about PowerView. There are other sessions at this conference about PowerView. If you're not very familiar with it, I definitely encourage you to go learn about it. But that is only available in SharePoint integrated mode. And even if you've seen PowerView integrated into Excel, on the desktop, all you really need is Excel desktop. But as soon as somebody publishes that to SharePoint, on the server side, that requires not only Excel services to work, but also reporting services to work. So you need reporting services in SharePoint mode for that. There are some limitations, but as you can see, they are very much outweighed by the benefits of choosing SharePoint mode. One is linked reports. If you're familiar with this feature in native mode, basically you can create a variation of another report. You could say it's like the other report, it refers to that, except it overrides some settings. Maybe it overrides some of the default parameter values, or it overrides the caching settings. Depending on what you're using it for, you could have a workaround in SharePoint mode. If you're just using it because you want a variation of the report that uses different default parameter values, luckily, you can specify parameter values in the URL. So then in SharePoint, you could just have a link that overrides them via the URL. And you can even mimic the look and feel of a document because there's a content type in SharePoint called link to document, which looks like a document, but it's really just a URL pointing to another one. And in that URL, you can override the parameter values. So that's by far the most common usage of linked reports, and that one you can achieve through that workaround. If, however, you're using linked reports because you want to override the caching settings or something less common, those are things, unfortunately, you can't do through the URL. So you don't have a workaround for that in SharePoint mode. Subscriptions are supported in SharePoint mode, but there's one view, there's one page in Report Manager in native mode called My Subscriptions, where rather than having to go to individual reports and see what subscriptions exist on them, you can see subscriptions that you've created or that you own all on one page. And it's a page called My Subscriptions. That one doesn't really translate to SharePoint mode. It doesn't exist in SharePoint mode. But I just want to be absolutely clear that subscriptions, including even data-driven subscriptions, are supported in SharePoint mode. Everything except just this one page that gives you a particular view of the subscriptions. Custom security extensions allows you to write a custom extension that customizes the way that end users authenticate to the report server. So instead of using, say, Windows authentication, they could use Live ID or whatever, some other authentication mechanism that you've added support for. In SharePoint mode, there's a different security model. SharePoint has sort of its own extensibility model for this. It's based on ASP.NET, and you can write a custom membership provider. So the functionality is similar, but the way you go about it is quite different. One that's sometimes come up here as a limitation that people ask about is performance. In the past, it has definitely been true that rendering performance in SharePoint integrated mode was definitely slower than native mode. Not slower in general, like everything is going to be a certain factor slower, but there was an additional latency at the beginning. So if your report took a minute to run, it might take a minute and 10 seconds to run, no big deal. But if it took 2 seconds to run in native mode, you may find it takes 5 seconds in SharePoint mode or something like that. So it was quite noticeable with fast-running reports. We did a lot of work on that in SQL Server 2012 to try and address that, and I'm very happy to say that right now, for what we call the single report scenario, where you have one report showing on our page or one report in a web part, the performance is as good, if not actually slightly better than native mode. So for that scenario, there's no reason not to go with SharePoint mode anymore. There still is a bit of a performance issue with what we call the multi-web part scenario, where you have maybe a dashboard with a bunch of web parts on the page, and you're trying to render multiple reports in different web parts at once. Unfortunately, right now, they all execute sequentially instead of in parallel. So that's where some of the additional performance overhead comes from for that scenario. So heading into the architecture now. How does reporting services integrate into SharePoint? How does it look when you're rendering a report in SharePoint integrated mode? What are the different components? How do they talk to one another? If you think about it, you have something running on the client. You have maybe the report viewer control. It could be running, say, in a report builder on my client. It could be running in a custom application. It could be the report viewer web control that's running on a web page, and it's running AJAX code on the web page. Another client that uses the same reporting services engine and server is PowerView, which is the Silverlight application that's running on the client side. Those connect to your front-end SharePoint web server. There are web services that run in there. There are HTTP endpoints that these clients communicate with. And they're communicating with those exposed by our add-in for SharePoint, the reporting services add-in for SharePoint products. This is the thing that goes on your front-end web server. Now, this is something that you can install through SQL Server Setup, but it's also a free component that you can go and download from the web. It's not a licensed component. So you need this to be installed on every front-end web server. So if you have a scale-out configuration with multiple web servers, it needs to be installed on all of them, but because it's not a licensed component, you don't necessarily need SQL Server licenses for all of those front-end web servers. That, however, is mostly the front-end components, and it delegates a lot of the real work to that service application that I mentioned, which gets installed on the app server tier, like any other service application in SharePoint. This is part of SQL Server proper, and so it is a licensed component. You do need a license of SQL Server 2012, and for PowerView in particular, it needs to be BI edition or higher. So BI edition or Enterprise edition, not Standard edition. And for the Excel services integration, you will also need Service Pack 1 for that. And then reporting services will go and connect to a variety of different data sources depending on the report and what the report references. So it could be a SQL relational database that a lot of classic reports will reference. It could be an analysis services cube or an analysis services database. It could be Oracle. It could be third-party data sources. It could be a bunch of other data sources. If it's, like I said, a classic report, it may connect to these things quite directly. If it is a PowerView report, then we always connect directly to analysis services, and it would be AS that would connect to these other types of data sources in turn. So that's kind of the architecture. I'm showing it there as kind of a 4-tier architecture. I mean, these could all be on one physical tier, on one physical machine, or they could be as many as 4 physical machines. So it's just the 4 possible tiers that you can have. For PowerView and Excel services, the architecture gets a little bit more complicated because we're going to throw Excel services into the mix. Here's how that works. You have the same 4 tiers, and I open up a workbook in SharePoint. I just click on the workbook. It opens up an Excel web app. Excel web app communicates with front-end components in the SharePoint web server. In this case, Excel, the web services that Excel exposes. And that delegates a lot of the real number crunching and data refresh functionality to Excel calculation services, which is their service application. So you can see some of the parallels with reporting services. SharePoint services tend to work this way. Now, you may know that in PowerView, Sheets can connect to the embedded data model. The data model, just kind of like a little database that's embedded within the same workbook. Or they could connect to a data model outside of the workbook somewhere else. It could be another workbook in SharePoint. It could be an analysis services database, but it's external to the workbook. If we're connecting to the embedded data model, that will connect to a version of analysis services known as, or a mode of analysis services deployment known as Power Pivot mode, which is basically an instance of analysis services tabular that you've configured, dedicated it to serving SharePoint and this scenario. So what will happen is Excel calculation services will have this instance of AS registered with it, and then it will take the model out of the workbook and stream it to this AS instance that's been specially registered. If it's connecting to an external data source, then it would just make a regular MSOLAP connection to SQL analysis services or whatever other data source it's connecting to. Now, what happens when you open up a Power View sheet in that workbook? You just switch to a Power View sheet. We load the Power View client app on the client side. From then on, everything works pretty much the way it works in reporting services in the previous slide. It's actually going against reporting services, not Excel services. So the front-end web component that it talks to is still the reporting services add-in. So you still need that. And then it goes and talks to SQL Server reporting services, the actual service application. So again, for this scenario, although they look like Excel workbooks and this looks like an Excel feature, it depends on reporting services on the back end, on the server side. So you do need SQL, BI, or Enterprise Edition and reporting services configured. And then what happens is we make all our connections through ADOMD.net. It's our managed data provider for connecting to analysis services. And really what goes on behind the scenes there, we're not too sure. It's kind of opaque to us. But what does happen is if we connect to the embedded data model, ADOMD will go and talk to Excel calculation services and say, where did you stream the model for this workbook? And does the current SharePoint user have permission to view that workbook? If so, then we'll go and make a connection to that database that's been previously streamed. If it's an external connection to some other workbook or some other database, then it'll just make a direct connection to analysis services without needing to go through Excel. Now, again, from a reporting services perspective, one little tidbit to know is that we don't really know. It's opaque to us. All this logic is in ADOMD.net and in Excel services. So now we're going to switch over to a demo. Just a little bit of information on my demo environment. It's, in my case, a single server. It's a VM that I have running on my laptop. It's running Windows Server 2012. I'm running SharePoint 2013 Enterprise. It does need to be Enterprise for the Excel services component because that requires Enterprise. And then I've installed SQL 2012 SP1 Business Intelligence. The SP1 is very important because the Office integration, the Excel integration for Power View requires SP1. Specifically, the components that I've installed a database engine, I've installed analysis services, just a standalone tabular version of it, and the Power Pivot version. And I've installed reporting services in SharePoint integrated mode. The starting point for the demo here is I've installed the bits. I have not done any post-install configuration. So that's the more interesting part that I'll show you. I'm not going to go through the whole process of setting up SharePoint. It's not really the focus of this session, so I'm assuming that you have a little bit of knowledge about setting up SharePoint, and if not, you can go and find other resources for how to do that. So I've already set up my SharePoint site. I'm also not going to go too deep into the details of setting up Excel services or Power Pivot. So those have already been set up in my case. There's another session that I will refer you to at the end of the session that will actually show how to do that step by step. But just to give you a really quick glimpse, one way that's really easy to set up a SharePoint site, let's say you're just starting from scratch or you want to do this for evaluation purposes. If you know you want a SharePoint site for BI and you just want the full BI stack, a really great quick way to do that is with Power Pivot for SharePoint and the Power Pivot configuration tool. Basically just run SQL Server Setup. After installing SharePoint, you run SQL Server Setup and you choose this option to install SQL Server Power Pivot for SharePoint. And then after it installs, it'll run this configuration wizard. And the configure wizard will look at the state of your SharePoint farm and look at the state of your SharePoint sites and figure out what's missing and then go and configure everything that's missing. So if you haven't even configured a SharePoint site collection yet, it'll go and do that for you. It'll go and create the root site. It will go and create the analysis services instance and Power Pivot services, start them and everything. So by the end of it, you've got an up and running site with pretty much everything except reporting services. So that's where we pick up. To install reporting services, what I did was ran SQL Server Setup again. Under Shared Features, you will have a couple of different checkboxes for those two different components. One is the add-in that goes on the web front end. The other is the service application that goes on the app server. If I were doing a scale-out configuration where I have two different physical tiers, I wouldn't be installing them both on the same box. I would be installing one on the web front end and one on the app server. In this case, I just have a single server installation, so I'm installing them on both. Did you have a question there? The reporting services add-in needs to go on all the web front ends. In contrast to the service application, does not need to go on all of your app servers. Because it's a licensed component, if you have 10 app servers, you don't have to run it on all 10 and have 10 licenses. You can run it on 2 or 3, whatever scale you feel you need. Yeah. A standalone database server? If you have a separate server hosting your SQL Server databases, like for the SharePoint content databases or for the reporting services catalog databases, you don't need any reporting services component installed on those. No. The database, so there's a whole matrix of when you install reporting services in a certain edition, what edition of the database engine do you need to host the catalog database? And if you have, I don't believe it needs to be enterprise, but it's a sort of complex matrix. So I can probably point you to that matrix afterwards if you like. But for example, you can't have enterprise reporting services connecting to SQL Express hosting your content databases. So there are some limitations. Now, the other reason why you'll have the database engine instances of those is not to host the infrastructure, not to host SharePoint catalog databases or reporting services catalog databases, but actually to host your data, to host the data that you're going to pull into your models. That can be whatever edition you have or whatever edition you like. OK, one more question, and I'll get back to the demo. Yep. Reporting services needs the database engine, yes, because reporting services still maintains its own service application database, which hosts kind of a clone of the catalog and a bunch of other configuration information. So you need to point it. You'll see when we create the service application, we'll need to point it to a database server somewhere. And that's the one where, like I said, there are some edition restrictions. There are certain combinations of editions that are supported, and there are some that are not supported. You can definitely point it to a different database engine as long as it is a supported version and edition. Yeah. So once you've chosen the two components of reporting services and you install them, whereas with native mode, you can choose to actually run essentially reporting services configuration manager within setup and do all the configuration here. With SharePoint, it does not work that way. You only install the bits, and then you go to SharePoint, and that's where you configure everything. So that's what I'm going to show you right now. So we'll just switch over here. OK, so like I said, everything happens in SharePoint Central Administration. So hopefully this is a familiar sight to you. And the first thing we should really check after having installed reporting services is that the actual service, the actual process kind of, is running. So here I can go and look at my services on my server. And I see SQL Server reporting services. And that has been started. So that's running. We're good there. But we don't actually have an instance of a service application created. So all the service application, web application configuration you can find under the section called Application Management. And there's a link here for Managed Service Applications. I'll click on that. And here are all the service applications that I have. You can see Power Pivot, which is what the Power Pivot config tool created, Excel services, Secure Store. I don't have anything for reporting services yet. So I'm going to go New, Reporting Services Service Application. Now, sometimes you won't see that listed. And it has to do with the order of when you installed SharePoint and when you created a SharePoint farm and a SharePoint site, and when you install reporting services. If you install SharePoint first, and you get at least a root site collection created, and then you install reporting services after as an add-in to that, which is what I did. That's kind of the recommended way of doing it. Then, when we're running reporting services setup, we have a SharePoint farm that's already configured that we can go and call its APIs, and we can go and register this. However, if you install reporting services first, and then install SharePoint, and then configure SharePoint, then when we ran reporting services setup, it was too early for us to do anything with SharePoint because it wasn't configured, didn't even exist. So you won't see that there. So if you run into that situation, or just for whatever reason you don't see it listed there and you think it should be, it's probably not installed or registered yet. And what you have to do, anything programmatic in SharePoint, you have to run the SharePoint PowerShell management console. And then you have to run a couple of PowerShell commands. Install SPRS service and install SPRS service proxy. Okay, just those two commands right there. Install the service and install the proxy. And then if you go and refresh this page, you would see it listed there. So now I'm going to check reporting services service application, and we'll give it a name. We'll call it reporting services application. And then you have to assign it to either an existing application pool or a new application pool. Don't confuse these with IIS application pools. That's the web front end. This is the back end. These are just pools with an identity that's associated with them, and these services run under some identity. So I'll give this its own dedicated application pool. I'll call it reporting services app pool, and then choose some account for it to run under. You have to choose a domain account. The best practice would be try and isolate your services as much as possible, have them run under different accounts. And then here's where you point it to the database server. This is where the service application is going to create the databases that it needs to store its catalog, to store temporary information. So it's just on my local machine in this case, and the best practice is to authenticate to it from the service to the database with Windows authentication. And then finally, this is a really important checkbox, because this will associate the front-end web server with the service application in the back end. If they're not connected, then the service application is just kind of orphaned in the back end, and you can't hit it from the front end. So check this box, and it will create that association for you right now. If you forget to check it, you can create the association later, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So depending on my luck, this usually takes between 1 and 3 minutes. So this would be a really fantastic time for a question, I have to say. Yes? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the end of that. It is the same. So the question was, the SQL Server instance that I put in there, is it the same one I use for the SharePoint environment? In my case, yeah, it's the same one I use to host my SharePoint config and content databases. It doesn't have to be, but it is in my case. OK, we're good. So now I have my application, services application. If you click on it, you'll see a whole bunch of management options here, particularly under system settings. Just give this a second to warm up. You'll see settings for setting timeouts and setting levels of logging and, yeah, for example, session timeouts and report execution timeouts and whether you want execution logging, all that sort of stuff. So now we've got our service application created. Like I said, if you had forgotten to check that box, and maybe it's just a good idea anyways, let's check whether the web application is associated properly with the service application. So here, if you go to Configure Service Application Associations, I have one web application. It's just my default web application on port 80. That's hosting my SharePoint site. I can see the application proxies that it's associated with. If I click on the proxy group here, I can opt to exclude some of them or connect some of them if they weren't connected. So here it's connected to reporting services, so we're good. So at this point, that's actually really it. We should be able to render a basic reporting services report. So here's my SharePoint site on port 80. And here, what I'm going to do is go to Files, and I want to create a new reporting services report. And for some reason, it's taking a little while to load the ribbon. OK, so new document. Now, I don't see any BI file types there, any BI content types. So I need to do that. I need to add those there, because this is a library I'm going to use to create some BI content. So I will go to Library. I'll go to Library Settings. did click on that, I think. Library settings. I'm running all this stuff on one VM on a laptop, so it can be a little bit slow sometimes. There we go. Now, there's no place here for me to modify the content types. The reason is that by default, SharePoint does not expose, it kind of hides the management of content types. So if I go to Advanced Settings, then the first option is Allow Management of Content Types. Yes, I want to do that. Click OK. Now, I have an option on this page or a section on content types. And the only one that's listed there is document. So let's add some BI content types. Click Add from existing site content types. And then the main one I want is I want Report Builder Report. I want to be able to create Report Builder reports. Now, the reports may connect to data sources. I may need to create data source files or connection files, so I'll also add report data source. And I'll also add BI semantic model connection, which is not a reporting services specific thing. It's installed with Power Pivot, but it's another type of connection file I may want to use. So I'll click Add, and then click OK. And now when I go back to Documents, and I go to Files, I will see those content types listed here. Now, another catch, another hiccup that happens sometimes. If I went to content types and I didn't see those content types listed there, that suggests that probably the feature is not activated. You know, a feature in SharePoint terminology that if the feature is activated, you'll see new content types, you'll see new context menu items, but if the feature is deactivated, you may not see them. So you can check that. You can just go to Site Settings here. And under Site Collection Administration, because these features are site collection level features, you can go to Site Collection Features. And then you'll see something there for Report Server Integration Feature. And it is activated, so that's good. You'll also see Power View Integration Feature separately for Power View. So you can deactivate Power View separately from classic reporting services. So those should both be activated if you want all of that functionality. So now we've got my content type added. And here, I'm going to create a new Report Builder report. Now, Report Builder, you can install it also as a free web download, and you can just install it as a traditional installed application. But it's also a Click Once application. So I'll install the Click Once app here. And with it being installed as a Click Once application, when my users go to the report server, for the first time, they'll get it downloaded like this. And then if I patch my report server, it will patch Report Builder, and they'll get the patches, and I don't have to patch the clients directly. So now this is going to run Report Builder. This is being installed on the client. It's a thick client application. Yeah. But it's still got kind of this reference back to the server where it was installed from, and it will check there every time for updates. So I'll create a blank report. And I just want to test that the report server functionality is working just by rendering a basic report. So I could do something really basic here, like a hello world or something. But let's, I don't know, let's have a little bit more fun here. So what I'm going to do is write an expression. So I'll explain this expression in a second. Dot millisecond. Mod 2 equals 0. Now, I need a couple of volunteers. It's not going to be anything too embarrassing, so don't worry. So, can I get a volunteer? Somebody? Nobody. We got one person. Okay, what is your name, sir? Ryan? Did I get that right? Ryan. And where are you from? Charlotte. All right. So we're going to say Charlotte rocks. Can I get another volunteer? Somebody? Yes? What's your name? David. And where are you from? Kentucky. Kentucky Derby for the win or something. I don't know. Okay, so what this expression means, if I zoom in on this, it is the millisecond when the report was executed. The reason I'm asking what the millisecond the report was executed is because it's unpredictable. I have no idea what the millisecond is going to be. Mod 2 equals 0. If it's even, it's going to show one of these strings. If it's odd, it's going to show the other string. So we're going to have a showdown between Ryan and David here. So, and I'll pick your favorite, and let's see which one it renders. So it's going to take a second for the report server to warm up here because this is the first time we're hitting it. You can feel the suspense. Charlotte rocks. Congratulations. There you go. So what I'm going to do now is save this to the report server. I'm going to save this to SharePoint. Just going to save it in shared documents. We'll call it showdown.rdl. Come on, there we go. And if I refresh this, I should see that report here. Okay, now, that was just running a report builder. We want to make sure that it renders on the server. So you're going to get a chance to redeem yourself, I guess. Let's see if we get the same result or a different result. Now I get the same result. Sorry, I tried. So we got classic reports working. Now let's see if we can get Power View working. So I go up to Documents again, Files. And here, I don't see any content type or anything for Power View. And you won't. Because with Power View, the way we launch is a little bit different. You don't create a report and then go find a bunch of different data sources. Your entry point for creating a standalone Power View report is from a connection file or from a data source. So we just need that. So here, I have a BISM, BI Semantic Model connection file. If I just click on that, that will actually now launch Power View by default. Whereas before, that would not have worked. So here we go. We're running the Silverlight application in the browser. Hopefully everything will work just fine. Looks like it. Let's just create a basic visualization so that we know everything is working and the processing and rendering is all working correctly. So we'll grab a couple of fields here. We'll maybe add a measure by counting something up here. And create a basic line chart. There you go. There's a basic Power View report. Everything seems to be working. Okay? Now, the third piece of the puzzle is, yes, that's fine, leave this page. Third piece of the puzzle is Power View in Excel services. So here I have a workbook that's got a Power View sheet in it. So if I open that up, let's see if we have to do anything else to get that working. This might take a sec, just launching Excel services for the first time. So here you can see we've got a Excel web access is opening. We've got a number of sheets. And this sheet is a Power View sheet, so we're getting the Power View application loading within this sheet. Sorry? To create these, you need Excel 2013. And then to view them, you need SharePoint 2013. Yes. OK, so that works. Everything is working. We go to another sheet. Everything seems good. So got that all working. So let me switch back to my slides here. So it might look like we've got everything working, right? We got classic reports working. We've got standalone Power View reports working. We've even got Power View sheets and Excel services working. So what could possibly be left? Well, not so fast, because what you can connect to in Excel workbooks could be an embedded data model, could be an external data model, and the way you authenticate to it could be configured in a number of different ways. And the way all the identities flow around all these different components and get delegated from one tier to another varies across all those scenarios. So you have to make sure you have all of them working. In that scenario, I was showing an embedded data model. The model was inside the same workbook. So the way that works is when the user authenticates to SharePoint, the end user, SharePoint authentication uses claims. So from, especially within the farm, within the web server and the app server tiers, we're getting a claims token into the report server service application that identifies the user. Now, What we do with that claims is, because we're still within the SharePoint farm, we can use those claims, and we can talk to Excel calculation services, and we can say, does this user have access to, have permission to this workbook? And we do the authorization check based on that identity. So the end user must be able to view that workbook. Excel calculation services is able to do a similar check internally, because it's the one that has the knowledge of workbooks and checking permissions on workbooks. If that all checks out fine, then we continue. Otherwise, we throw an error. If we continue at this point, we've already authorized the user. Everything's good. There's no role-based security. It's all or nothing. The user either has access to the full data in the workbook or they don't. So whatever identity we use beyond this point is really not as important. So what we do is we connect. Excel services will connect to the AS instance. We'll connect to the AS instance, but we don't attempt to delegate the user's identity anymore. We actually just use the process account. We revert to that process account. And that account must be an administrator account on the AS instance. So the more interesting cases here are when you have external data models. When you have external data models, you have a connection in the Excel workbook that points to some other workbook or some other database. And then there's a setting in the workbook where you can say, how do you want the end user or the system to authenticate to that data source? The default is to use the authenticator user's account, which means they're going to try and use the person logged onto SharePoint and somehow delegate their identity to that data source. That would be ideal, because in practice, you just want to delegate their identity as much as possible and show them the data that they are allowed to see. But there's some complexity involved in setting that up. So sometimes people will choose one of the other options. Another option is to use a stored account, to use stored credentials. If you're familiar with reporting services, you may know that we have a concept of stored credentials. They're stored in the report server catalog encrypted. This is not referring to that, because, again, this is now an Excel scenario, and they use a credential store that's built into SharePoint. It's not even specific to Excel. It's part of SharePoint, and it's called the Secure Store Service. And that's where SharePoint service applications can store credentials, is in this Secure Store Service. The reason that reporting services doesn't use it, by the way, is that reporting services SharePoint integration was developed before Secure Store existed. And also, reporting services was not originally developed as a SharePoint integrated application. It was a native mode separate application, unlike Excel. And then the third option is kind of poorly labeled as none. It's not really none. What happens is, if we're connecting to something like analysis services, it does need some identity. And the identity that it uses will be a special identity or special set of credentials that you can configure in Excel services called the unattended service account. And that's something that has to be set up as well. So here's how these scenarios work. For the authenticated user, the default, what happens is we get, again, the claims for, say, me or you just logging into the SharePoint site, coming into the app server tier. To connect to analysis services, it only supports Windows authentication. It does not support claims. So we need a Windows token. So how do we take a claims and get a Windows token? The answer is kind of forehead-slapping obvious, with a service called the Claims to Windows Token service. So anyway, so this has to be configured. It has to be working properly. And it converts. It does exactly what the name says. It converts a claim to a Windows token. Now, however, in order for that to work, you're still kind of taking this Windows token on a second hop, in the sense that you have one hop between the client and the SharePoint farm, and then these database servers are probably not in the SharePoint farm. They're probably in separate machines. To delegate a user's identity over that second hop, you need some sort of identity delegation mechanism, that usually being Kerberos. So you have to configure Kerberos constraint delegation. And that's certainly the preferred and security best practice way of doing it. If, for whatever reason, you cannot configure Kerberos, there is one fallback option, and that's to use a connection string property in analysis services called effective username. Effective username basically says, on the thread, I will connect as me or as some stored credential, some unattended account, but I'm going to put in the connection string an identity of the real user that I want you to act as. I want you to give me the data and run the queries as if I were that user. So there are options within Excel services that will allow you to use that mode if you don't have Kerberos. Namely, here's the option. In Excel services, this is new in Excel services, by the way. So in Excel services, you can go to the service application settings, and there's a checkbox for use the effective username property. If you check that box, rather than use Kerberos, it will try to use effective username. In order for that to work, again, the account needs to be an administrator on the AS instance. So the Excel services account would need to be an administrator. Secure store, the way that works is, again, we have claims coming in that identify the user. And we want to, we need a Windows token to pass to analysis services to authenticate to it. But we're not just going to try and convert the claims into an equivalent Windows token that identifies the same user. Instead, we're going to be doing something different, which is we're going to try and use the claims to look up in the secure store some credentials that have been stored and granted to that user for use. So we use the claim, we look up in secure store, we say, as this user, can you give me some credentials that I can use for this particular scenario? Secure store will give us back those credentials if they've been granted to us, and then we can use those to connect to AS. Finally, you have the unattended service account scenario where, if my clicker will work, there we go. We need to connect to AS, and it still needs a Windows token, but we are not going to even look at the user's claims or try and do anything with them. Every user is going to connect with this unattended account. So we're just going to look up a particularly designated special target application in Secure Store that stores this Excel unattended account. Now, the way we still need some permissions to look up those credentials, the ones that are used for Excel calculation services, it uses its own service account to look up those credentials. For reporting services, we already have our own concept of our own unattended account called the unattended execution account, and we will use that to look up the credentials in Secure Store. So this is getting into one of the more complex scenarios to set up. But now I'll show you how to set this stuff up. So here I have workbooks that use those different authentication mechanisms. So for example, I have one that's connecting to an external model using just the authenticated user default setting. Everything looks fine here, right? If I look over at the Power View sheet, it asks me if I want to refresh, and I say yes. It's going to load Power View here. And there we go, that rendered fine. So it rendered fine not because I configured Kerberos, but because I don't need Kerberos in my case because I have everything running on one machine, so there isn't that second hop. But if I did have a second hop, this would have failed, and I would have needed to go configure Kerberos. Now, what about Secure Store? So I can open up this one, and it uses Secure Store. And everything looks fine, right? Except that it's not. With Excel, native Excel sheets, it's maybe a little bit misleading because Excel will actually cache data, cache charts, and cache tables and stuff like that in the workbook. This is not actually running the query. It's not actually connecting to analysis services. It only does that when I try and refresh. So now if I refresh, yes, I want to refresh, this is going to fail. And it doesn't really give me a lot of detail as to why it failed. If I go over to Power View, I'll get a Power View error. And if I open up the details here, I will get some details. That should give me a clue as to what the problem is. So here, sure enough, it says, cannot retrieve credentials from Secure Store service. Target application not found, the ID is called healthcare. So I have this healthcare database, and this workbook was configured to look for a target application, which is basically a set of credentials in Secure Store called healthcare, and it's not finding it. So that makes sense because I haven't configured that in Secure Store. So let's go back to service applications here. And we'll go to service applications. And I'm just going to clone this for a sec. And let's go to Secure Store service. This is listing the target applications, listing the set of credentials that we have. There's not much in there. There's a Power Pivot unattended account, but there's no other target application, certainly not one called healthcare. So I can create a new one. And we will call it healthcare. I'll give it a contact email, which it insists on having. And then you can create different types of target applications. You can create individual ones or group ones. What a group one means is that I'm going to grant these credentials to a bunch of different users. all of those users, when they request credentials, will get the same credentials. If I choose individual, I will grant permissions to a bunch of different users to get credentials from this target application, but I will grant each of them credentials individually. And they could all get different credentials, which means they could all get different levels of access to the data. So it mostly depends on whether you have that requirement. There's some other stuff in here about ticketing and restricted versions that I won't go into too much. Ticketing is a feature in Secure Store. It will still work, but there's no benefit of choosing it. Excel services doesn't really do anything with it. Reporting services doesn't either. Definitely don't choose restricted because it won't work in either. So usually just individual group or what you'll be choosing. So I'll choose group, click next, and then these are the credentials that you're going to be storing in the target application. They must be of type Windows username and Windows password, because that's what AS requires, is Windows credentials. I'll click next. And then we assign an administrator to administer this target application. That will be just me. And then we assign members. Members are the people who have permission to retrieve the credentials. So in my case, I'm just going to say all domain users. For this particular target application, I'm fine with giving them these credentials. So now we've created that. If we go back to Excel, refresh this, and go to Power View, let's give it another go, because now we have the target application. And it still fails. The reason it still fails is if I look down, now it says something different. Credentials were not found for the current user within the target application healthcare, because we never actually assigned the users of that target application any credentials. We just said they can get the credentials. So there's a separate step. You need to click on the target application here, and then go up to here where it says credentials, and say set the credentials. So click that. And then I have a particular Windows user account that I've created to access this database, and just put in those credentials. Okay. Now let's give it a try. Let's refresh again. Hopefully it should work this time. No, it doesn't. That's not part of the demo. What did I do wrong? I'm not sure which checkbox you're referring to, but I think I just mistyped the password. Okay. I think we have enough time, so let me see if I can just fix it really quickly. I think I just said it wrong. Oh, you're saying that just cleared after? Yeah. Yeah, it will do that after you close this dialog, I believe. So let me try this one more time. Type carefully. Yeah, see, it'll clear. Now let's try it again. Come on, better luck this time. What? Really? Username or password is incorrect. Okay, I have no idea, but we can move on. I promise you that will work. It's just complaining that my password is incorrect. But anyways, so there's the unattended version as well. So in this case, if I try and refresh, it will say, data connection uses none as the external authentication mechanism, but the unattended service account has not been configured. So I need to configure the Excel services unattended account. Where I do that is I go into the Excel services application, I go into its settings, and down at the bottom here, there is a place for me to put in the credentials that I want to use to connect to data sources as the unattended account. So I will call this, so I have an account for this, and it's called XLS unattended. Click OK. Now take a look at what that did. If I refresh Secure Store, you'll see that it created a new secure store target application for the unattended account. Now if I go back, rerun this, and I refresh, in the case of Excel services refresh, really no news is good news. Here, nothing happened, so that means it's working. Now, what about the Power View sheet? That still doesn't work. The reason it still doesn't work is because, like I said, Excel services is going to look up those unattended credentials with its service account. We are going to look up our credentials, reporting services, with our unattended execution account, which this is saying is not configured. So we need to configure our unattended service account. So let me go back to service applications. This time, go to reporting services application and go to execution account. There's a whole section for it. And yes, I'm going to specify an execution account. And similar to Excel, I have an account created for unattended execution. In this case, I called it SQL RS unattended. And I'll click OK. I'm sorry? Managed accounts in what sense? I'm not sure what you mean by them being managed. They're just Active Directory Windows accounts. Okay, so this shouldn't take long, but here we are. Okay, there we go. So now let's try refreshing this again. And go to Power View. Now it's going to try logging in with the unattended account, and it's going to try looking up those credentials in Secure Store. And it still doesn't work. And the reason why is I created the Excel Services unattended service account as a target application in Secure Store. Then I created the reporting services unattended account, which we're going to use to try and look those credentials up. I have not granted the reporting services unattended account permission to go and do that. And these things are kind of oblivious of each other. So I need to go back to Secure Store and go to this target application that Excel created. Excel created it knowing only about Excel and granting only permission to itself. So here, for me to proceed, it's going to force me to put in an email here. And I'll go to the next page. That looks fine. See, so the only thing it granted permission to was this service account, which is the account that Excel Services is running under. The other thing that needs to pull these credentials is reporting services. So I need to add SQL RS unattended here. Now I'll click OK. And now reporting services, just like Excel Services, should be able to get these credentials. So go back here and refresh. Go over to the Power View sheet. And hopefully with a better result this time. Yes. OK, great success. All right. So that pretty much concludes what I have for you today in terms of demos. I want to switch it back to the slides here. There are some things that I didn't show. I showed you pretty much everything there is to configuring reporting services and how to integrate reporting services into SharePoint and how to configure all the authentication with Excel services. But some of the parts where I just showed you screenshots in the beginning were setting up Power Pivot. And there's a whole session, 312 there, from my colleague in the analysis services team who will show you step-by-step how to set up Power Pivot. So if you want to see that part of the process, I would definitely go take a look at that session. Another of my colleagues, Chuck, is a real expert on setting up all this sort of infrastructure on VMs in the cloud in Windows Azure. And if you're interested in that, I would go check out his session. And then I myself have another session that's more about reporting services, report creation, just some tips and tricks for how to create nice reports and reporting services. So if you're interested in that side of RS, definitely come to my session. Finally, we have Ask the Experts tonight. So if you have any questions about reporting services or Power Pivot or any of the BI stuff, a couple of colleagues of mine and I will be there. So hope to see you then.